It was one of those perfect Saturday evenings when everything just felt right. Captain Robert Johnson had spent the afternoon watching his 8-year-old daughter play soccer, cheering from the sidelines with the other parents. The game had gone. Well, his daughter's team won 2-1, and she was over the moon about scoring her first goal of the season. As they walked back to his car, she couldn't stop talking about how she wanted to practice more kicks in the backyard tomorrow. Robert had been with the FBI for 15 years now, working his way up through dedication and hard work. He specialized in white-collar crime and had put away some pretty big fish over the years. But right now, none of that mattered. He was just a dad, proud of his little girl, driving home in his regular clothes with soccer gear in the back seat. The suburban streets of Atlanta were quiet at this time of evening. Most families were probably sitting down for dinner or getting ready for Sunday church tomorrow. Robert had the radio playing softly, some classic rock station his daughter had surprisingly gotten into lately. She was in the passenger seat, still, wearing her grass-stained jersey, scrolling through photos on his phone from the game. He wasn't speeding, at least he didn't think so. Robert was always careful about following traffic laws, partly because of his job and partly because he just believed in doing the right thing. The speed limit on Maple Street was 25, and he was probably doing exactly that, maybe 27 at most. So when he saw the police car's red and blue lights flashing in his rearview mirror, he was genuinely confused. His daughter looked up from the phone, her eyes wide with worry. Kids always get nervous when they see police lights, even when they haven't done anything wrong. Robert gave her a reassuring smile and pulled over to the curb, making sure to use his turn signal and stop in a safe spot under a streetlight. This should be simple enough, he thought to himself. Maybe his registration sticker was expired, or perhaps one of his taillights was out. These things happened. He'd show his license, get a warning or a small ticket, and they'd be home in 10 minutes. His wife was making her famous spaghetti and meatballs tonight, and he didn't want it to get cold. The officer who got out of the patrol car walked with purpose toward Robert's vehicle. Even in the dim evening light, Robert could see this wasn't going to be the friendly, routine stop he'd expected. The officer's hand was resting on his duty belt, and his whole body language screamed aggression. This was Officer Patterson, though. Robert didn't know his name yet. Patterson was a 12-year veteran of the local police force, but not the kind of veteran other officers looked up to. Instead of approaching the driver's side window like most traffic stops, Patterson positioned himself slightly behind Robert's car, making it difficult to see him clearly in the side mirror. When he finally stepped up to the window, his flashlight was already in his hand and he was shining it directly into Robert's eyes. Robert rolled down his window and immediately put both hands on the steering wheel where Patterson could see them. This was basic stuff that every law enforcement officer knew from both sides of the equation. Stay calm, be respectful, follow instructions, and everything goes smoothly. But Patterson's first words weren't the usual, "Do you know why I stopped? You? Or license and registration, please." Instead, he barked out an order that caught Robert completely off guard. "Get out of the car. Now." Robert blinked, temporarily blinded by the flashlight still shining in his face. His daughter shifted nervously in her seat, and he could feel her looking at him for guidance. This wasn't normal procedure for a simple traffic stop, and Robert's 15 years of law enforcement experience told him something was very wrong here. "Officer, can you tell me what this is about?" Robert asked politely, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I don't believe I was speeding, and I'd like to understand why you've stopped me." Patterson took a step closer to the car, his flashlight beam never wavering from Robert's face. "I said get out of the car. Don't make me repeat myself again." The tone was hostile, aggressive, and completely inappropriate for what should have been a routine interaction. Robert felt his pulse quicken, not from fear for himself, but from concern for his daughter. She was just a kid who wanted to go home and tell her mom about her soccer goal. She didn't need to see whatever this was turning into. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she whispered, her voice small and scared. Robert reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "It's okay, sweetheart, just stay calm." Then he looked back at Patterson, trying to keep his voice level and professional. "Officer, I'm going to comply with your request, but I'd like to identify myself first. I'm Captain Robert Johnson with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. As he spoke, Robert slowly reached toward his jacket pocket where he kept his credentials. He moved deliberately, making sure Patterson could see exactly what he was doing. This was standard procedure when one law enforcement officer identified himself to another. Show your badge, establish professional courtesy, and move forward respectfully. But Patterson's reaction was the opposite of what any reasonable person would expect. Instead of acknowledging a fellow officer, instead of stepping back and reassessing the situation, he became even more aggressive. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Patterson shouted, his voice carrying down the quiet residential street. "Don't reach for anything." Several porch lights had started coming on in the nearby houses. Neighbors were beginning to notice the commotion, and some were stepping out onto their front steps to see what was happening. Mrs. Chen from across the street had her phone in her hand, though Robert couldn't tell if she was just curious or actually recording. Robert slowly raised both hands, keeping them visible above the steering wheel. His FBI training kicked in, and he began analyzing the situation like he would any other potentially dangerous encounter. The officer was clearly agitated, possibly having a bad day or dealing with some kind of personal issue. The best approach would be to remain calm, follow instructions, and try to de-escalate whatever was happening here. His daughter was now gripping his arm, her soccer celebration completely forgotten. Robert could feel her trembling slightly, and it broke his heart. This should have been one of the best days of her young life, a day she'd remember forever because of her first goal. Instead, it was turning into something that might give her nightmares. "Officer, I understand you're just doing your job," Robert said, keeping his voice as calm and respectful as possible. "I'm going to step out of the vehicle as you've requested. My credentials are in my jacket pocket, and I'd like to show them to you so we can clear this up quickly." Patterson stepped back as Robert slowly opened his car door, but the officer's hand had now moved to rest on his service weapon. This was escalating far beyond anything that made sense for a simple traffic stop, and Robert was beginning to realize that his race might be playing a factor in how this encounter was unfolding. As Robert stepped out of his car, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, he noticed that more neighbors had come outside. Someone definitely had a phone pointed in their direction now, and he found himself oddly grateful for that fact. Whatever was about to happen, there would be witnesses. Robert stood beside his car with his hands clearly visible, trying to process what was happening. In all his years of law enforcement, he'd never experienced anything like this from the other side. The evening air felt heavy around him, and he could hear his daughter's worried breathing through the open car window. "Officer, I'm reaching for my credentials now," Robert said slowly, moving his hand toward his jacket pocket at a pace that would make anyone comfortable. "I'm FBI Captain Robert Johnson, and I just want to show you my identification so we can resolve this misunderstanding." But as Robert's fingers touched his wallet, something inside Patterson seemed to snap. The officer's face twisted with an expression that Robert had seen before, but never directed at him personally. It was the look of someone who had already made up their mind about who they thought they were dealing with, regardless of the facts. "I said, don't move," Patterson screamed, and suddenly Robert found himself staring down the barrel of a police service weapon. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. Robert's training told him to stay calm, but his heart was racing as he realized the gravity of the situation. Behind him, he heard his daughter gasp, and that sound cut through him like a knife. She was 8 years old. She should be at home right now, showing her mom the grass stains on her jersey and asking for extra meatballs at dinner. "Daddy?" Her voice was tiny, confused, terrified. Robert raised his hands higher, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "It's okay, baby. Just stay in the car and don't move." His voice was steady, but inside he felt like his world was falling apart. How do you explain to a child that sometimes bad things happen to good people for no reason at all? Patterson was sweating now, despite the cool evening air. His grip on the weapon was tight, and Robert could see his finger resting dangerously, close to the trigger. This wasn't proper police procedure by any stretch of the imagination. This was something else entirely. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Patterson snarled, his voice filled with venom that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ugly inside him. "Coming into our neighborhood with your fancy car and your attitude, thinking you can just do whatever you want." Robert blinked, genuinely confused. His car wasn't fancy at all. It was a 3-year-old sedan, practical and reliable, the kind of car a federal agent on a government salary would drive. And what attitude. He'd been nothing but polite and respectful from the moment Patterson had approached his window. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Robert said carefully. "I'm a federal law enforcement officer just like you. I have my badge and credentials right here in my jacket. Can I please show them to you?" But Patterson wasn't listening to reason. If anything, Robert's calm professionalism seemed to make him angrier. "You're not like me," he spat, using words that Robert had hoped his daughter would never hear directed at her father. "You're nothing like me, and that fake badge isn't going to save you tonight." The racial slurs hit Robert like physical blows, not because he hadn't heard them before, but because his little girl was hearing them now. In the car behind him, she was crying softly, and Robert felt a rage building inside him that he had to fight to control. But he knew that losing his temper now could cost him everything. It could cost both of them everything. "That badge is real, officer," Robert said, his voice still steady, despite the storm of emotions inside him. "I've been with the FBI for 15 years. I work out of the Atlanta field office. You can verify this with a simple phone call." "Shut up," Patterson screamed, stepping closer with the gun still pointed directly at Robert's chest. "You're going to lie down on the ground right now, or I'm going to put you down myself." By now, at least a dozen neighbors had come out of their houses. Robert could see them standing on their porches and sidewalks, phones in their hands, recording everything. Mrs. Chen from across the street was on her phone, probably calling 911. Mr. Rodriguez from next door was shaking his head in disbelief. These were good people, Robert realized, people who knew right from wrong when they saw it. "Please, officer," Robert said, glancing back at his daughter who was now crying openly. "In the front seat. My 8-year-old daughter is in the car. Whatever you think I've done, whatever this is about, please don't do this in front of her." But Patterson seemed to take pleasure in Robert's distress. "Maybe she needs to see what happens when people like you don't show proper respect," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Maybe it's time she learned how the real world works." The words hit Robert harder than any physical blow could have. This wasn't just about him anymore. This officer was actively trying to traumatize his child, to destroy her innocence and her faith in the system that her father had dedicated his life to serving. "Please," Robert said again, and for the first time his voice cracked slightly. "She's just a little girl. She scored her first soccer goal today. She's supposed to be happy right now." Patterson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Well, I guess this is turning out to be a pretty educational day for both of you, isn't it?" Robert slowly began to lower himself toward the ground, knowing that compliance was his only option with his daughter watching. As his knees touched the asphalt, he could feel pieces of gravel pressing into his skin through his jeans. The same jeans he'd worn to cheer for his daughter just an hour ago, when the world still made sense. "Hands behind your head," Patterson ordered, clearly enjoying the power he held over someone he perceived as thinking they were better than him. As Robert complied, placing his hands behind his head, he could hear his daughter sobbing in the car. Other neighbors were getting closer now, their voices carrying on the evening air. Someone was shouting that this was wrong, that they were calling the police. The irony wasn't lost on Robert that someone was calling the police on a police officer. "Officer Patterson," came a voice from behind them. Robert couldn't turn around to see who was speaking, but the voice sounded official, authoritative. "What's the situation here?" Patterson didn't lower his weapon. "Got a suspect here claiming to be FBI," he called back. "Probably stolen credentials. You know how they are." Robert closed his eyes for a moment, realizing that Patterson had just revealed something important. He knew Robert claimed to be FBI, which meant he'd been listening, but he'd chosen not to believe it, or more likely, he'd chosen not to care. This wasn't about mistaken identity or miscommunication. This was about something much darker. The backup officer's footsteps were getting closer, and Robert found himself hoping that this new arrival might be the voice of reason that could end this nightmare before it got any worse. His daughter needed to go home. She needed to hug her mother and forget that people like Patterson existed in the world. But as the seconds ticked by with that gun still pointed at him, Robert began to understand that some lessons about the real world come whether you're ready for them or not. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the quiet neighborhood as backup units arrived on scene. Robert remained on his knees with his hands behind his head, the rough asphalt digging into his skin. He could hear his daughter's muffled sobs from inside the car, and each cry felt like a dagger to his heart. What was supposed to be the best day of her young life had turned into something that would probably haunt her for years to come. Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez stepped out of her patrol car and immediately knew something was very wrong. She'd been supervising officers for over 8 years, and she'd never seen a traffic stop that looked like this. A man in civilian clothes was on the ground at gunpoint while a little girl cried in the front seat of a sedan. The crowd of neighbors with their phones out told her this situation was already way beyond anything that could be quietly resolved. "Patterson, what's your status here?" she called out, walking toward the scene with purpose. She could see Patterson was still holding his weapon on the suspect, which was completely against protocol for a routine traffic stop. "Got a suspect here claiming to be FBI," Patterson replied without taking his eyes off Robert. "Refusing to comply with lawful orders. Probably got fake credentials," Rodriguez frowned. In her experience, people who claimed to be law enforcement during traffic stops usually actually were law enforcement. It was a pretty stupid lie to tell since it could be verified with a simple radio call. She walked closer, studying the scene more carefully. Robert lifted his head slightly, making eye contact with the supervisor. "Sergeant, I'm Captain Robert Johnson with the FBI. My credentials are in my jacket pocket. I've been trying to show them to your officer, but he won't allow me to reach for them." There was something about the man's voice that struck Rodriguez immediately. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who was used to being in control of dangerous situations. His posture, even while kneeling, showed the kind of discipline that came from years of law enforcement training. This didn't look like a suspect. This looked like a fellow officer. "Patterson, lower your weapon," Rodriguez ordered. "But Sergeant, he could be lying. You know how they—" "I said lower your weapon, now." Patterson reluctantly holstered his gun, but his hand remained resting on it. Rodriguez walked over to Robert, who was still kneeling on the ground. The whole situation felt wrong to her, and she'd learned to trust her instincts over the years. "Sir, I'm going to need to see that identification," she said professionally, but not unkindly. "Can you tell me where it is?" "Inside jacket pocket, left side," Robert replied. "I've been trying to show it to your officer for the past 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Rodriguez felt her stomach drop. A traffic stop should never take 20 minutes unless there was something seriously wrong. She carefully reached into Robert's jacket and pulled out a leather wallet. When she opened it, her heart sank. The gold FBI badge gleamed under the streetlight, and the identification card was clearly legitimate. Captain Robert Johnson, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Atlanta Field Office. 15 years of service, high-level security clearance. This wasn't just any federal agent. This was someone with serious rank and responsibility. "Jesus Christ, Patterson," she whispered under her breath. Then louder, "Sir, you can stand up now. I apologize for this misunderstanding." Robert slowly got to his feet, his knees stiff from kneeling on the hard pavement. He brushed off his jeans and immediately turned toward his car where his daughter was still crying. Through the window, he could see her face was red and puffy from tears, and she looked absolutely terrified. "Sweetheart, it's okay now," he said gently through the glass. "Daddy's fine. Everything's going to be okay." But even as he said the words, Robert knew they weren't entirely true. Everything wasn't okay. His daughter had just witnessed her father being treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of his skin. She'd heard words directed at him that no child should ever hear. The innocence of her perfect soccer day had been destroyed by one man's hatred and ignorance. Rodriguez was studying Robert's credentials more carefully now, and she was getting angrier by the minute. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or poor judgment. This was a complete failure of basic police procedure and human decency. "Captain Johnson, can you tell me exactly what happened here?" she asked, handing him back his wallet. Robert looked over at Patterson, who was standing about 10 feet away, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "I was pulled over for allegedly speeding. When I tried to identify myself as a federal agent, Officer Patterson refused to look at my credentials. Instead, he drew his weapon and forced me to the ground while making several inappropriate comments. Rodriguez knew she was dealing with a potential career-ending situation, not just for Patterson but possibly for the entire department. A federal agent had been held at gunpoint by one of her officers, and it had all been recorded by multiple witnesses. The videos were probably already being uploaded to social media. "Patterson, get back to your vehicle," she ordered. "Don't talk to anyone until I've had a chance to sort this out." "But Sergeant, I said get back to your vehicle, now." As Patterson walked away, Rodriguez turned back to Robert. She could see the anger in his eyes, but also the professionalism. He was handling this situation better than most people would under the circumstances. "Captain, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me," she said quietly. "Do you believe this stop was racially motivated?" Robert looked at her for a long moment before answering. He could have been diplomatic about it. He could have given her an answer that would make everyone's life easier. But his daughter was watching, and he'd spent his entire career fighting for justice and truth. "Yes," he said simply. "I believe it was." Rodriguez nodded slowly. She'd been afraid of that answer, but she'd also been expecting it. In her years of supervising officers, she'd seen enough to know that racial bias was a real problem in law enforcement. She'd tried to address it through training and counseling, but clearly she hadn't been successful with everyone. "Captain, I want you to know that this doesn't represent our department or our values," she said. "What happened here tonight was completely unacceptable, and there will be consequences." Robert opened his car door and helped his daughter out. She immediately wrapped her arms around his waist, holding on tight as if she was afraid he might disappear. He could feel her small body shaking against him. "I know there are good officers out there, Sergeant," Robert said, his hand gently stroking his daughter's hair. "I work with them every day. But this is something my child will remember for the rest of her life." Rodriguez looked down at the little girl, still wearing her soccer jersey, still holding on to her father like her life depended on it. The sight broke her heart. This child should be at home celebrating her first goal, not traumatized by police brutality. "I'm going to personally ensure that a full investigation is conducted," Rodriguez promised. "And, Captain, I know this probably doesn't mean much right now, but I'm truly sorry this happened to you and your daughter." Robert nodded, but his focus was entirely on his child now. Nothing else mattered except getting her home safely and somehow helping her understand that the world wasn't always as scary as it had seemed tonight. The next morning brought no relief for Robert Johnson. He sat at his kitchen table, still wearing the same clothes from the night before, watching the sunrise through his window while his daughter slept upstairs. His wife, Catherine, had stayed, up with him most of the night, holding his hand as he recounted every detail of what had happened. She'd cried when he told her about their daughter's tears, and she'd gotten angry when he described Patterson's words. But mostly, she'd just listened, because sometimes that's all you can do when the world reveals its ugly side to your family. The videos had already gone viral. By 6 in the morning, Robert's phone was buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, friends, and FBI colleagues who had seen the footage online. The title of one video read, "FBI Captain Held at Gunpoint by Racist Cop," and it had been viewed over 2 million times in just 8 hours. The comments section was exactly what you'd expect from the internet, a mix of outrage, support, and unfortunately, some people defending Patterson's actions. Robert's boss, FBI Director Williams, called him personally at 7 a.m. It wasn't often that a field office captain got a direct call from headquarters, but then again, it wasn't often that one of their senior agents became the victim of such a public civil rights violation. "Robert, I've seen the videos," Director Williams said without preamble. "How are you holding up? How's your family?" "We're managing, sir," Robert replied, though the exhaustion in his voice told a different story. "My daughter is pretty shaken up, but kids are resilient. She'll be okay." "This is completely unacceptable," Williams continued. "I want you to know that the full weight of the FBI is behind you on this. We're opening an immediate civil rights investigation, and we'll be working closely with the Department of Justice to ensure this officer faces federal charges." Robert appreciated the support, but part of him wondered if things would have moved so quickly if he wasn't a federal agent. How many regular citizens had experienced similar treatment from Patterson over the years without anyone in power caring enough to investigate? By noon, FBI investigators were already deep into Patterson's background. What they found was disturbing but not entirely surprising. Agent Taylor, who was leading the internal investigation, called Robert with an update that made his stomach turn. "Captain, we've analyzed Patterson's arrest records for the past 5 years," Agent Taylor reported. "The statistics are pretty damning. He's 3 times more likely to use force during traffic stops involving black motorists. He's written twice as many citations to minority drivers for minor infractions. And we found at least 6 formal complaints filed against him for excessive force, all involving people of color." Robert closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. 6 complaints? How was he still on the street? That's what we're trying to figure out. It looks like most of them were either dismissed or resulted in minor disciplinary action. A few days of unpaid suspension, some additional training, nothing that would have removed him from patrol duty. The pattern was clear, and it painted a picture of a system that had failed repeatedly to address a problem officer. Patterson hadn't suddenly become racist overnight. This had been building for years, and the department had either ignored the warning signs or chosen not to see them. Meanwhile, the local police department was conducting its own internal investigation, though everyone knew it was mostly for show. Sergeant Rodriguez had been placed in charge of the inquiry, and she was being thorough, but the damage was already done. The videos spoke for themselves, and there was no way to spin what had happened into anything resembling acceptable police conduct. Rodriguez interviewed every neighbor who had witnessed the incident. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman from across the street, broke down crying as she described what she'd seen. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, Mrs. Chen told Rodriguez. "I've never seen anything like that. The way that officer spoke to that man, the things he said to him in front of his little girl, it was heartbreaking." Mr. Rodriguez, no relation to the sergeant, had recorded the entire incident on his phone. When he showed the footage to investigators, even the seasoned detectives were visibly shaken by Patterson's behavior. "You can hear everything clearly," Rodriguez explained to her superiors. "The racial slurs, the threats, the complete disregard for proper procedure. There's no way to defend this." 3 days after the incident, federal prosecutors made their decision. Patterson would face 3 serious federal charges: deprivation of rights under color of law, brandishing a firearm during the commission of a crime, and federal civil rights violations. Each charge carried significant prison time, and together they could result in decades behind bars. The news hit the local police department like a bomb. Officers who had worked with Patterson for years were forced to confront the reality that one of their colleagues was not just a bad cop but a criminal. Some defended him, claiming he was just having a bad day or that he'd been taken out of context. But most recognized that what they'd seen on those videos was inexcusable. Chief Martinez held a press conference to address the situation. He was a good man who had spent his career trying to build trust between the police and the community, and Patterson's actions had undone years of progress in a single evening. "What happened to Captain Johnson and his daughter is not representative of our department's values," Chief Martinez said, facing a room full of reporters and community members. "We will cooperate fully with the federal investigation, and we will take whatever steps are necessary to ensure this never happens again." But the community wasn't satisfied with words alone. Reverend Thompson, a local civil rights leader, organized peaceful protests outside the police station. The crowds were diverse, including police officers from other departments who wanted to show their support for Robert and their disgust with Patterson's behavior. "This isn't just about one bad cop," Reverend Thompson addressed the crowd. "This is about a system that allowed this officer to continue his pattern of behavior for years without consequence. How many other families have been traumatized by this man? How many other children have been forced to watch their parents humiliated and threatened?" The FBI's investigation revealed the answers to those questions, and they were troubling. Over the past 5 years, Patterson had been involved in at least 23 incidents where complaints were filed against him. Most were minor, but several involved excessive force or inappropriate conduct during routine stops. In almost every case, the complainants were people of color. Robert found himself becoming the reluctant face of police reform. He didn't want to be a symbol or a spokesperson. He just wanted to go back to work and help his daughter heal from what she'd experienced. But he also understood that his position as an FBI captain gave him a platform that most victims of police misconduct didn't have. "I became a federal agent because I believe in justice," he told a reporter from the local newspaper. "What happened to my family was wrong, but it's not unique. The only difference is that I have a badge and the resources to fight back. Most people don't have that luxury." The case was moving quickly through the federal system, faster than most civil rights prosecutions. Patterson had been suspended without pay pending the outcome of the criminal charges, and his police union had quietly declined to provide him with legal representation after seeing the videos. As Robert tucked his daughter into bed 3 weeks after the incident, she asked him a question that broke his heart. "Daddy, are all police officers like that mean man?" Robert sat on the edge of her bed and chose his words carefully. "No, sweetheart. Most police officers are good people who want to help others. But sometimes bad people get jobs they shouldn't have, and when that happens, the good people have to make sure they face consequences for their actions." She nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness that only children can bring to complex topics. "Will he go to jail?" "I think so," Robert replied honestly. "And that's important because it shows that no one is above the law, not even people who wear uniforms." The federal courthouse in Atlanta was packed on the morning of Patterson's sentencing. It had been 8 months since that terrible evening when Robert's perfect family day had turned into a nightmare, and finally, justice was about to be served. Robert sat in the front row with his wife Catherine and their daughter, who was now 9 and had grown stronger through this difficult journey, though the shadows of that night still haunted her dreams sometimes. The trial itself had been relatively quick, with multiple video recordings from neighbors' phones and Patterson's own body camera footage. There wasn't much room for defense arguments. The evidence was overwhelming, and Patterson's own words had condemned him more than any prosecutor ever. Patterson's defense attorney had tried everything they could think of. They claimed he was having a mental health crisis that night. They said the stress of the job had gotten to him. They even suggested that he hadn't really understood that Robert was actually an FBI agent. But none of it held water when the jury watched those videos and heard the hatred in Patterson's voice. The most damaging evidence had come from Patterson's own department. When investigators went through his computer and phone records, they found text messages with other officers that contained racist jokes and comments. They discovered that he was part of several online groups that promoted white supremacist ideologies. This wasn't just a bad day or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was who Patterson really was. During the trial, Robert had to testify about what happened that night. It was harder than he'd expected, having to relive those moments in front of a courtroom full of strangers. But the hardest part was when the prosecutor asked him to describe how the incident had affected his daughter. "She used to love police officers," Robert had said, his voice steady but filled with sadness. "Whenever we'd see a patrol car, she'd wave and get excited. She wanted to be a police officer when she grew up, just like her dad works with law enforcement. After that night, she was afraid of uniforms for months. She'd hide behind me whenever she saw a police officer, even the good ones who came to her school for safety programs." The jury had listened intently as Robert described the therapy sessions his daughter had needed, the nightmares that woke her up crying, and the difficult conversations about race and injustice that no parent should have to have with their 8-year-old child. Patterson's victims from previous incidents had also testified. A young teacher named Michelle, who had been pulled over for a broken taillight and ended up face down on the pavement for 20 minutes. A college student named David, who had been walking home from work when Patterson stopped him for looking suspicious in his own neighborhood. An elderly man named George who had been verbally abused during a traffic stop for driving too slowly. Each story painted the same picture. Patterson had been targeting people of color for years, using his badge and uniform to intimidate and humiliate anyone he saw as beneath him. The pattern was so clear that even Patterson's own colleagues couldn't deny what he'd been doing. When the jury announced their guilty verdict on all counts, Robert felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that justice had been served, but sadness that it had taken his family's trauma to finally stop Patterson from hurting others. Today was sentencing day, and Judge Harrison had a reputation for being fair but firm. She'd been on the bench for 15 years and had seen every kind of case imaginable, but this one had clearly affected her personally. "Officer Patterson," Judge Harrison began, looking down at the man who now seemed much smaller than he had that night on Maple Street. "You took an oath to serve and protect all citizens, regardless of their race, religion, or background. Instead, you used your position of authority to terrorize and humiliate people based solely on the color of their skin." Patterson sat silently at the defense table, his head down. His wife had filed for divorce 3 months into the trial, and his 2 teenage sons had stopped speaking to him after they saw the videos online. He'd lost everything, and today he would lose his freedom too. "The evidence in this case shows a pattern of behavior that spans years," the judge continued. "You didn't just have a bad day, Mr. Patterson. You systematically targeted minority citizens for harassment and abuse. You violated their civil rights, you traumatized their families, and you brought shame to every good police officer who puts on a uniform to genuinely serve their community." Robert's daughter squeezed his hand as they listened to the judge's words. She'd asked to come today, wanting to see the man who had scared her held accountable for his actions. Robert had been unsure about bringing her, but his wife had convinced him that seeing justice done might help with her healing process. "Captain Johnson," Judge Harrison said, turning to look at Robert directly, "I want you to know that what happened to you and your family was completely unacceptable. No one should ever be treated the way you were treated that night, especially not in front of their child. I hope that today's sentence sends a clear message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated." The judge then announced Patterson's sentence: 6 years in federal prison followed by 3 years of supervised probation. It was a significant sentence that would effectively end Patterson's career and send a strong message to other officers who might think they could abuse their authority without consequences. As the bailiff led Patterson away in handcuffs, Robert felt his daughter lean against his shoulder. "Is it over now, Daddy?" she whispered. "This part is over," Robert replied, softly, "but the work isn't finished yet." He was right about that. The case had sparked changes that went far beyond Patterson's punishment. The local police department had implemented new training programs focused on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, not just those on probation. And most importantly, a new oversight committee was created to review complaints against officers, with community members serving alongside police officials. Chief Martinez had kept his promise to reform the department. He'd brought in outside consultants to review their policies and procedures, and he'd created new pathways for community members to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. It was a start, though everyone knew that real change would take time. Robert had used his unwanted fame to advocate for police reform across the country. He'd spoken at conferences and training seminars, sharing his story and helping other law enforcement agencies understand how one bad officer could damage community trust that took years to build. "I don't want to be the FBI agent who got held at gunpoint," he'd told audiences. "I want to be the agent who helped make sure it doesn't happen to someone else's family." His daughter had slowly regained her trust in police officers, especially after meeting some of the good cops who had reached out to apologize for Patterson's behavior. Officer Williams from the Community Relations Unit had become a family friend, often stopping by to check on them and showing his daughter that not everyone who wore a badge was like Patterson. The viral videos from that night had been viewed millions of times, sparking conversations about race and policing in living rooms and classrooms across America. Some people watched and felt angry. Others watched and felt ashamed. But most people watched and felt motivated to do better, to be better, to create a world where 8-year-old girls didn't have to watch their fathers be humiliated for no reason other than the color of their skin. 6 months after the sentencing, Robert received a letter from a young police academy cadet who had seen his story on the news. The cadet wrote that Robert's experience had inspired him to become the kind of officer who would speak up when he saw misconduct, who would protect all citizens equally, and who would never let fear or prejudice guide his actions. That letter, Robert thought, made everything they'd been through worth it. Change was possible, one person at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment of courage at a time. And maybe, just maybe, his daughter would grow up in a world where justice truly was blind to the color of someone's skin.